Hello there, and welcome back to the LRJ Chess channel. I hope you enjoyed the last video about chess history. I know it was a little different than the other videos I've released, but I wanted to show you how playing chess was more than just moving pieces on a wooden board. I have an idea for a couple more videos like that in the future, so let me know in the comments if that was something you liked and want to see more of, or if that was something that you didn't really like and just wanted to stick with the actual chess instructions. My thought is that chess is a great game with so much history attached and so many stories attached to the pieces, the board, and the positions that have happened, that I have made stories in my career, other people have too, and now it's time for you to create your own chess stories. But to do that, you have to learn how to play the best chess you can. So let's get started. Where do we start, however? Well, that's easy, at the beginning. A chess game can be sliced up into 3 distinct phases: the opening, the middle game, and the end game. Since we're at the beginning of the chess game right now, we're going to start at the opening phase. This video and 1 or 2 more will focus all on opening strategies that you can use. If you've watched my previous lessons, either about chess history or about the basic rules of chess, you know that white has 20 possible moves to start the game. But 3 moves out of these 20 are known to be much better than the rest. Those would be the moves e4, the moves d4, or the move knight to f3. The reason why these 3 moves are known to be better than the rest is they all do something important. They attack central squares, and they open up lines for other pieces or immediately develop a piece. The most popular moves are e4, d4, and knight f3 as your starting move. The reason why is that all 3 of these starting moves attack the central squares. The 2 pawn moves also open lines for your bishops and queen, while the knight move develops a piece immediately. So I mentioned a term earlier, central squares. That's not something I've talked about before, but it is crucial to your opening strategies. So what are these central squares? Well, if you look at a chessboard, like the one showing on the screen right now, there are 4 squares smack dab in the middle of the board. Those would be e4, e5, d4, and d5. Those 4 squares are considered the center of a chessboard, and controlling those squares is exactly what you want to set out to do in the beginning of the game. If you are able to control the center right out of the start from a chess game, your pieces can move from those central squares onto the queen side or the king side of the chessboard. With central control, your pieces have that free range of movement, while your opponent will not have that same luxury. Your opponent is going to have a much harder time moving his pieces freely because your opponent is not the one that controls the center. Think about it this way. Imagine the chessboard where there was a giant wall right in the middle. If you were the one to control that wall, you could allow your pieces to move from one side of the board over to the other very easily, while your opponent would have to fight and struggle to get over the wall or through the wall or anything to get their pieces from one side to the other. That is how important central control can be in a chess game. Your main goal at the beginning of a chess game, get your pieces into the game and make sure they're controlling the center. So now you can see why e4, d4, or knight f3 are widely considered the best opening moves. They all attack the center in different ways and activate your pieces. Let's look at some other opening moves and figure out what's wrong with them. First, we have a4. This is a problem because it doesn't attack the center and it doesn't help get your minor pieces into the game. Sure, it opens up your rook a little bit, but that's not really going to help when the focus should be on controlling the central squares. c3 is a bad move because it doesn't put a pawn in the center. It does look at one central square, but at the same time it blocks the developing square that your b1 knight wants to go to. This knight loves the c3 square because it attacks e4 and d5. which are both central squares. What about knight h3? This does develop a piece, but it's still a bad move. The reason why is because the knight is put on the side of the board. It can't attack the center from this far away, and it doesn't have many squares that it could go to from here. There are only 3 possible squares that it could move to. There's a saying in chess, knights on the rim are dim, and this is a clear example of that. When the knight is on the side of the board, it has much more limited mobility than if it were in the center. f3 is probably the worst starting move for many reasons. First, it doesn't actively put a pawn in the center. Second, it blocks the main square that your g1 knight wants to go to. This is very similar to the downside of the move c3. Your knight wants to use the f3 square because it looks at d4 and e5, which are both central squares. Third, this move f3 doesn't help to activate any of your other pieces. And fourth, it also weakens your king. Look at how moving this pawn up opens up this diagonal that black could use to go in and check your king. This could be a problem later on in the game. There are 2 other moves that you might see. Some people like to play f4, and while it does attack the center, this still weakens your king, but it allows the f3 square for your knight. I still think this is a bad starting move. Another one you'll see sometimes is c4. Now this move isn't actually that bad, even though it doesn't really help to activate your other pieces yet. This c4 move does move a pawn to attack the center. So that is one benefit of it. And there aren't many other downsides. It doesn't block the c3 square for your knight. It doesn't weaken your king. It actually opens up your queen a little bit. But the reason why this isn't one of the best moves is because it doesn't actively put a pawn in the center and open up your other pieces or develop a piece into the center. So those are the main reasons why all of the moves I showed you were bad and why e4, d4, and knight f3 are usually the best starting moves. The key thing to notice from this part of the lesson is that e4, d4, and knight f3 all attack the center and develop or prepare to develop your other pieces. The other moves we looked at just don't do that. To play a good opening, you need to control the center and develop your pieces. Those are 2 of the 3 major goals in the opening. Before getting to goal number 3, let's reinforce the idea of developing your pieces to control the center. There are 2 main principles to think about when deciding where to develop your pieces: activity and threats. Activity is measured by how many squares a piece can go to. More possible moves equals more activity. Each piece is important and should be put where it is most active. The words activity and mobility will usually go hand in hand. This position on the screen shows the difference between developed pieces with maximum activity and developed pieces with limited activity. I'm sure everyone would want to play as white here. Notice how white has full control over the center as well. His pieces can move freely around the board, while black will find it harder to do the same. So you may be wondering, how did we get to a position like this? Let's see the moves leading up to here. So to start the game, white played e4. And as we know, this is one of the 3 best starting moves. It puts a pawn in the center and opens up the bishop and queen. Black responded with d6. So that's not one of the best opening moves. It does move a pawn to attack a square in the center and open up the bishop, but it doesn't directly challenge white's control over the central squares. White then followed up with d4. Now you may be thinking right away, white isn't moving out his bishop or moving out his knight. He's moving another pawn. But the key to see here is that black did nothing to prevent white from getting this 2-pawn center. Look at how white's pawns are both on central squares and both control central squares. So white definitely has good control over the center. Black played a6, a move which does nothing. White developed one of his knights to its perfect square, which attacks the center. Black played a good developing move. This moves the knight into the center and attacks the e5 and d4 central squares. White played bishop f4, developing a piece and attacking the center. Black played knight a7, moving that same piece again away from the center and into the corner. So that's definitely not a good move. White played bishop to c4, developing yet another piece and putting it in the center. Black played knight h6. This is not a good developing move. It harkens back to knight h3 for white when we looked at the first starting move and said that it was a bad move. White played knight f3, developing a piece into the center. I want you to notice how white is spending one move getting all of his pieces into the center, while black is not really doing the same. Black played bishop d7. This technically is a developing move, but notice how the bishop on d7 does not attack the center. Queen d3, queen b8, castles. This is something that we will get into later. This is a very special type of chess move. I will spend a lot of time explaining what just happened, but for now, I just want you to put a pin in that, because we're going to be much more focused on developing the pieces and controlling the center. Black played e6. White played rook d1, and then rook to e1. Notice how white's last two moves both moved his rooks onto the central files. While they may not directly attack the central squares, they're still on very strong central files. Black played bishop d8, yet again a move that really does nothing. White played h3. This doesn't do much other than open up the king one square, which could be useful later on, another topic we'll touch on. But the point is that after this move h3, we have reached the position that you saw in the beginning, and now you see how white got to such a dominant position. He used each one of his moves with the same purpose: develop pieces and control the center. Since black did not do the same, you can now see how white's position got so much better than black's, even though they had the same number of moves. And that is why it's so important to focus on developing your pieces and controlling the center in the beginning of the game. Another thing to know is that all of your pieces should have a purpose in the opening, and making threats is something that each of them can do. A threat in chess is when one of your pieces, or multiple pieces, attack the opponent. They could threaten to take a piece, or check the king, or any number of things to make life harder for the opponent. When deciding where to put your pieces in the opening, try to figure out which moves make threats. Those moves will usually help to improve your overall position. Activity and making threats usually go hand in hand in a chess game. When one side activates their pieces, it becomes much easier to make threats. Check out this position, which shows the white pieces making many threats against their black counterparts. Do you see how many more threats white has than black has? Let's take a look. White's threats include the move bishop takes a6, capturing a rook, bishop takes f7, capturing a pawn and putting the enemy king in check. We have e5, which is a double attack. The pawn simultaneously attacks the bishop and the knight. We have bishop takes f6, which is a capture. We have knight b5, which attacks the bishop on d6. And we have pawn to d5, which attacks the knight on c6. That's a lot of arrows on the board, but the takeaway from this position is that activating your pieces while making threats is a clear way to fight for the advantage in chess. If your opponent responds incorrectly, you'll get a great position in no time, just like white did in this example. As a side note, look at how white also controls the center. That makes it a lot easier to make threats and be more active. Before we move on, there are two terms that I'd like you to understand. The first is minor pieces. Minor pieces refer to your bishop and your knight. The second is major pieces. Those refer to your queen and your rook. These two terms are going to be important, and they're going to be ones that I'm going to use many times in future videos. So now, along with this term, you now know that a main opening strategy is to move up your central pawns, develop your minor pieces, your knights and your bishops, and make sure you're controlling the center. And ideally, when you're developing your minor pieces, you want to move them to squares that make threats. But you have two minor pieces, a knight and a bishop. Which one should be developed first? That's where this next strategy comes into play. When deciding whether to develop your knights or your bishops, I'd like you to keep in mind to develop your knights before your bishops. Let me show you some concrete reasons and examples to reinforce this idea and show you why it's true for many chess positions. Let's head on over to the board. When deciding whether to develop knights or bishops, let's look at all of the squares each piece can go to. The knights control the center from the squares f3 and c3, or f6 and c6 for black. However, the bishops can attack the center and make direct threats from d3, c4, or b5, and e3, f4, and g5. If the bishops go to d3, c4, e3, or f4, they directly attack central squares. And if they go to b5 or g5, they can make threats against the opponent. A bishop on b5 will usually put the king in check or attack a knight that comes to c6, while a bishop on g5 could threaten the queen or attack a knight that comes to f6. With this many squares, it might not be obvious which choice is best. There are many openings where bishops should be developed to c4 and f4, or d3 and e3. There are also openings where the bishops can go to any other combinations of squares to control the center and make threats. With so many different openings and potential options to develop your bishops, it would be much better to first see how the position turns out. That's why you should wait, develop the knights first to the squares that they almost always go to, and then determine where the bishops should go based on the new position. Let's check out this common opening called the four knights defense, where both sides follow this strategy and develop their knights before deciding where they should put their bishops. White starts by playing the move e4, black responds e5, white plays knight f3, developing his knight into the center and attacking the e5 pawn. Black plays knight c6, defending the e5 pawn. White plays knight c3, developing another piece and defending the e4 pawn. Black plays knight f6, developing his knight and attacking the e4 pawn, but he is not threatening to take it because white had already made a move to defend that pawn. Now with the knights out, we can see how the position has clarified, and white has two good choices for his bishop. It can go to c4 and attack the center, or it can go to b5. In the game, white chose bishop to b5, and the reason why is because he's making a direct threat. Back on the second move, we knew that white played knight to f3 to attack this e5 pawn, and black played knight to c6 to defend that pawn. The purpose behind bishop to b5 is to try and get rid of this knight so that there will no longer be a defender on e5. If black, for example, plays a random move or does not deal with the threat, let's say he plays a6 to threaten the white bishop, white could play bishop takes c6, removing the defender of the e5 pawn, and when black recaptures, white can capture the e5 pawn for free and win one pawn. That's why, even though bishop to b5 did not develop into the center, it developed with a threat. Hopefully now, after this example, you can see how it's much better to start by developing your knights and then choose where your bishops want to go based on how the position turns out from there. And that's the end of this simple strategy. All right, moving on to the next lesson, I'd like to teach you an important pitfall to watch out for in the opening. I myself have been guilty of making this mistake a lot, and I know every other chess player has as well. Vincent, I'm talking to you especially. What I'm talking about and what I'm referencing is moving the same piece multiple times in the opening. Now, it may not seem like doing that once is really a big issue. You have so many moves and so many options. If you move your knight once and then move it a second time, that's not really going to damage your position. But think about this. If you do that over and over and over again in the opening, you're going to be neglecting your other pieces and won't have anything else developed. If you just move one piece over and over again, you aren't improving your position. You're giving your opponent so much time to better their position and attack you. That's a recipe for disaster, and that's how you lose games quickly in the opening. Just remember, a previous opening strategy that you already learned from this channel is to treat the opening as a place to develop all of your pieces. Not just one or two, all of them. So if you spend time moving the same piece multiple times, you're taking away moves that other pieces could use to develop. That's not helping you develop all of your pieces. So that would violate another strategy that we've talked about before. Now, I mentioned that I have made this mistake many times, and it is true. When I was a kid, my favorite piece was the knight. Of course, it's a lot of players' favorite piece. The knight's tricky L-shaped maneuvering makes it really difficult to figure out where it can go next and what it will do. I always liked using my knights in games because I could attack my opponent and move them around the board without anyone expecting what could happen. When I played weaker players, this was fine. I never got punished for my knight maneuvering. But when I played stronger players and all I did really was move my knights around the board, they responded by developing all of their pieces, controlling the center of the board, shutting down my knight movements, and rolling over me and destroying me. So that was a mistake I quickly learned not to do. If I had spent more time developing my other pieces, I wouldn't have lost those games. Or at least, I wouldn't have lost in 15 moves, that's for sure. This mistake happens to so many beginners, and I just want to make sure it doesn't happen to you. So hopefully if you're watching this video, you can just have that little reminder in your head. If you want to move a piece a second time or a third time, maybe don't do that. Maybe develop a different piece instead. But at the same time, I don't want you to take this lesson too literally, because there will be times in the opening where you have to move a piece a second time, or even a third time. Think about this. Let's say you develop your queen, and then your opponent plays a move that puts his bishop in the attack of your queen. Well, if his bishop isn't defended, your queen could capture that bishop for free. That seems like something you'd want to do, right? Well, now let's say you get conflicted. You think, I just moved my queen. This would require me to move my queen a second time. Ladia said not to move pieces multiple times in the opening. That's the exact example where this strategy has an exception. Of course, moving the piece a second time to capture a free enemy piece would be a good thing to do. The main idea that I want you to take away from this little lesson on this strategy is that I want you to learn how every move in the opening, and in chess in general, should be used to develop your pieces, make them stronger, and improve your position. If a move that you're thinking about doesn't do one of those two things in the opening, it's probably not a good move. In the following game segment, I want you to notice how black moves his knight 4 times and his bishop 5 times, while white chooses to develop his entire army. It won't take long for you to realize how much better white's position is than black's position. It'll give you a clear example of what to do in the opening and what not to do in the opening. As a side note, I want you to know that this game that you're going to see may look a little bit similar to one that you've already seen. and I've done this intentionally, actually. A great way to improve in chess is repetition. Doing something similar or the same thing over and over and over again to practice what you've learned. So by seeing these positions multiple times, it'll help you get a better idea of what is good in chess and what is bad in chess. And soon enough, you'll be confident that you know what is good and what is bad. Repetition in chess is one of the greatest ways to improve. Repetition in anything that you're trying to learn is one of the greatest ways to improve. So that's something that I want to help you with. And with that said, let's get into the game. So white starts this game with e4, putting his pawn in the center. Black responds e5. White plays knight f3, developing the knight and attacking the pawn on e5. Black plays knight c6, developing his knight and defending the pawn on e5. White plays bishop to c4, developing his bishop and attacking the center. And now black plays bishop to d6. This does technically develop the bishop and attack the center, but what I want you to notice is that this bishop is blocked by its own pawns. It can't move backward because of the c7 pawn, and it can't move forward because of the e5 pawn. It also blocks the d7 pawn from moving up, allowing black to open up his other pieces. So this move isn't that great, and black would have had a better chance by moving his bishop to c5, similar to how white played. White responded with knight to c3, developing his knight into the center. Black played knight to e7. Now this move doesn't really make much sense because the knight was strong on c6, and it's not doing anything on e7. Black should have tried to develop a different piece. White got his king to safety. Again, this is a topic we'll touch on in the next video. Black played knight to g6, moving that knight for a third time. That's not going to be good. White played pawn to d3. This slightly increases his control over the center by protecting the e4 pawn, but more importantly, it opens up the bishop to be developed on future moves. Black played bishop to c5. The bishop is now on a better square than it was on d6, but once again, black is moving the same piece multiple times and should have instead prioritized developing other pieces. White played bishop to e3. This move does three things. It develops a piece, it attacks the center, and it also makes a threat to capture the black bishop. White is not worried about his bishop getting taken because it's guarded by the pawn on f2. Black played bishop to b4 to get out of the attack from the white bishop, but once again, it's moving that same piece again. White plays queen to e2, developing the queen and getting it on a slightly better square than its starting square. This also helps to connect the two rooks, meaning they can come into the center on future moves. Black plays bishop to e7, moving the same piece again. Hopefully you can see that black isn't doing anything to help his position, and moving these pieces multiple times just isn't improving his position at all. White played h3, making his king side slightly safer. Black played bishop f6. White played rook a to d1, putting his rook in the center, possibly planning to move this pawn up one square in the future to open up his rook and attack the center more. Black plays knight to e7 yet again. White plays rook f to e1, just developing his rook. Even though it can't really go to any new squares, in the future the rook will be much better placed on e1 than on f1. And that's where we'll end this position. What I want you to notice is the difference between white playing good opening strategies and black moving his pieces aimlessly. Black has not lost any material, but by only moving two pieces throughout the entire game, besides the one pawn move in the beginning, he has neglected to develop his other pieces and get his king to safety and control the center, while white has prioritized his development, spending one move to develop each one of his pieces. That's why white is so much better in this position. Since you now know that you don't want to move your pieces multiple times in a row, this actually also applies to all of your pawns as well. Of course, you will need to move your central pawns up to activate your pieces and control the center, but you don't actually have to move the other pawns right away. They can stay on their starting squares as you develop your other pieces. Notice how pawn moves like a4, b4, and c4 don't really help to advance your pieces. They attack some squares near the enemy territory, but they don't really control the center or activate your pieces. That's why we don't really need to play them in the beginning. Ideally, one of your goals in the opening should be to get a 2-pawn center. Pawns on d4 and e4 if you're playing as white, or d5 and e5 if you're playing as black. The key thing to notice here is that pawns on these central squares attack the other central squares that they aren't on. They also help to open up the bishops and your queen for future development. If you can't achieve this 2-pawn center without losing one of them, you can always settle for a 1.5-pawn center, as I like to call it. Consider a pawn on e4 and a pawn on d3, or a pawn on d4 and a pawn on e3, which are 2 examples from white's perspective. You have one pawn directly in the center, and the second pawn supporting that pawn in the center. Just make sure to remember to move out your bishop before blocking it inside that pawn chain. Otherwise, he's not going to be getting out anytime soon. So after you've moved these 2 pawns to make room for your other pieces and control the center, it's time to stop your pawn moves and focus more on your pieces. You want to get your knights out, your bishops out, you want to get your king castled into safety, you want to get your rooks into the game and your queen into the game. Once you have all that, then you can start deciding if other pawn moves would be necessary. But realize how the order of movement that you usually do, start with your pawns, then go to your pieces and your king, and then you can return to your pawns and see if there's anything else they want to do after you've developed your pieces, after you've gotten them into the game. For some practice on this, I want you to take a look at 3 positions that'll come up soon. Try evaluating them based on who you think is better in the position. The 3 evaluations you can use are white is better, the position is equal, or black is better. I'm going to leave the positions on the board for 5 seconds while you try and answer each of them, and then we'll review. Here is position number 1. Evaluating based on who has more control over the center. Do you think white is better, the position is equal, or black is better? For position number 2, what is your evaluation here? And for position number 3, what is your evaluation on central control here? This one is a little bit tricky. All right, and with those 3 quick little quiz positions out of the way, let's do some review. So this was the first position, and white definitely is better in regards to central control. He has the classic 2-pawn center, which is what you want to achieve, while black does not have any pawns in the center. In the second position, this is equal. Both sides have 1 pawn in the center, and they control the same number of central squares. In this third position, both sides have 2 pawns that are attacking the center, but black is slightly better because his 2 pawns are both in the central squares, when white only has 1 pawn in the center. Also, with black's pawns further advanced, he blocks off the white pawns, and you can see that the white pawn on e3 blocks the bishop on c1 from moving out into the game. So that is why black has slightly better central control in this position. All right, if you got all those questions correct, that's great. You really know the importance about your pawn centers. If not, that's okay again. Remember to take some time to review and come back swinging with 100%. Not everyone will get it fully correct the first time, but you know that practice makes perfect. With all this talk about pawns, there's only one more thing that I want to draw your attention to. Pawn moves are actually very committal. They're the only piece that can't move backwards. Any other piece you move, if you move it to one square, you could always choose to move it back to the square it just came from if you realize you made a mistake on the turn after. But with pawn moves, if you move your pawn from d2 to d4, you can never move that pawn back to d3 or to d2. It has to either stay on d4 or move to d5 or capture to the diagonal. It can never move back. Because of this, you really have to make sure that a pawn move is what you want to do. When deciding on whether or not to make a pawn move, there are two questions that I really like to ask myself that I find help a lot. Number one, does this pawn move increase my control of the center? Or number two, is this pawn move helpful to my position? For example, does it defend a new piece? Does it attack an enemy piece? Does it guard a key square? Does it open up any of my other pieces? Those are a lot of questions that you'll get more and more comfortable with as you go through the process many times. But the point is, after asking yourself both of these questions, if you can answer them both yes, then that pawn move could be good. But if the answer to them is no, then you definitely want to think about a different move. So for an example, let's say you're thinking about a move like pawn to d4. Question number one, does it increase your control over the center? The answer would be yes. And question number two, does it improve your position? Well, pawn to d4 opens up your bishop and opens up your queen, so of course, yes, it does improve your position. Since you could confidently answer yes to both of those questions, you know that pawn to d4 was a good move. What about pawn to h4, moving a pawn all the way over there? When we ask the questions, we see that this pawn move doesn't guard the center, but it does open up your rook a little bit. Since you can't answer yes to both of the questions, this is not a pawn move that you want to play early on in the game. Instead, you should be more focused on finding moves that develop your pieces, control the center, or make threats to your opponent, or even get your king to safety. Those would all be better than a move like h4. Sometimes these kind of things could be hard. Figuring out all of these answers to these questions can be difficult, but that's okay. Chess is going to be hard. You're going to have so many different positions, but that's also the joy of the game. Chess is a huge puzzle that you have to solve. And I hope that my questions and my little strategies can help you solve it. When you see the next position that I put on the board, I think you'll find it very obvious that white is having a terrible time. Try to figure out what they should have done instead to avoid this losing position. Notice how white has gone through this game only moving his pawns without developing any of his pieces. It may have only been a couple moves into the game, but black is almost winning. White can't do much to stop black's many threats in this position. With white's pawn moves, he may control the center, but he has done nothing to activate his pieces or protect his king, while black has his king protected and all of his pieces developed. It will only take a small breakthrough for black to be able to attack the white king and even get close to checkmate or clear material gain, while white can't really do anything because all of his pieces have not yet been activated. That was his main problem, and white would have been able to have a better game had he only moved his central pawns and then focused on piece development. I hope these last few positions that I've shown you will give you a better idea why it's so important to develop your pieces and control the center, and not use one piece many times over and over again. Your pieces should all be given an equal opportunity in the game of chess, because that way they'll work stronger together. If you single out one piece, even if it's your strongest, it can't really do much by itself. Even though one piece may be strong, it'll become much stronger when it's surrounded by its friends. Chess is a game that can clearly be represented by strength in numbers. A single piece alone can't get the job of checkmate done, but with 5 friends, they can definitely win the game together. Keep that in mind when you're playing. Your pieces need to work in harmony. Make sure you remember this so you can start playing the opening the correct way. In the next lesson, we'll start going over some opening strategies that will be a little bit more advanced than these. If you're feeling confident about your skills so far, that's great. I congratulate you, and I invite you to test your skills on the puzzles and quizzes that I have in the next video. Until then, this is LRJ Chess, signing off with a checkmate.